The staff supervisor glanced at the tall American in uniform. "That seat's already taken by someone important," she said. Color Sergeant Alistair Menzies had been assigned Seat 1A by royal protocol weeks in advance. But when a visiting U.S. colonel showed up demanding priority, the airline folded and quietly reassigned the British Guard without even telling him. 5 minutes later, the entire cabin crew and front gate staff were pulled off duty. So what happened on that plane? And who gave the order that flipped the airport upside down? Before we reveal the full story, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you never miss stories like this. And while you're here, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning rush at Heathrow's Terminal 5 was just beginning when Color Sergeant Alistair Menzies stepped through the automatic doors. At 41, he moved with the kind of purposeful calm that 15 years in the Coldstream Guards had etched into his very bones. His scarlet tunic was pressed to perfection, every button polished to mirror brightness. His navy trousers were creased razor-sharp down to his gleaming black boots. The tall black bearskin tucked neatly beneath one arm had seen ceremonial duties from Buckingham Palace to Windsor Castle, its fur still immaculate despite years of service. Gold braiding on his sleeves caught the terminal's fluorescent lighting as he walked, each thread representing decades of military tradition. On his chest, service ribbons told a story of deployments and dedication that most civilians would never understand. This wasn't costume jewelry from a theatrical supplier. This was the real thing, earned through sweat, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. Passengers hurrying past with their wheeled luggage did double takes. Some fumbled for their phones, trying to capture a glimpse of living history walking among them. Others simply stared, unsure whether they were witnessing pageantry or meeting someone genuinely important. A young boy of maybe 7 tugged insistently at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is that a real guard? Like from the telly?" His mother hushed him gently, but her own eyes lingered on Menzies' uniform. "Yes, love. From the palace, I think. Don't point, it's rude." Menzies paid no attention to the stares or whispered conversations. He'd been dealing with curious tourists and travelers for years, from the gates of Buckingham Palace to ceremonial events across the Commonwealth. His focus was singular: get to Edinburgh for tonight's memorial service at Holyrood House, where he'd stand vigil for fallen comrades who couldn't stand for themselves anymore. AT at the first-class check-in counter. The young agent straightened reflexively when she saw him approach. There was something about the way he carried himself, not arrogant, not demanding attention, just absolutely certain of his place in the world. "Good morning, sir," she said, her professional smile warming into something more genuine. "Color Sergeant Menzies," he replied simply, his voice carrying the crisp diction of a man accustomed to being heard clearly across parade grounds. "Seat 1A on the 9:05 to Edinburgh." She typed quickly, her screen blinking confirmation against the morning light streaming through the terminal's massive windows. "Yes, all confirmed. Royal Ceremonial Office booking. Here's your boarding pass, Sergeant." She handed it over with something approaching reverence, the way someone might pass along a family heirloom. Menzies accepted it with a brief nod, not dismissive, just economical with his gestures. Every movement had purpose. "Thank you," he said, then headed toward the executive lounge with the same measured pace that had carried him through 15 years of public duty. Upstairs in the executive lounge, the atmosphere was all leather chairs and muted conversation. Business travelers typed on laptops while CNN played silently on wall-mounted screens. Menzies chose a quiet seat by the window overlooking the tarmac, placing his bearskin carefully on the floor beside him like a trusted companion. He sat as he stood perfectly upright, hands folded, breathing quietly through his nose. His posture wasn't rigid or uncomfortable. It was the natural result of years spent standing at attention for hours at a time. A businessman across the room angled his phone discreetly, probably planning to show friends back home that he'd shared the lounge with one of the Queen's guards. Menzies didn't react. He was used to being treated like a living tourist attraction. From his inner pocket, he withdrew a slim notebook bound in black leather. The pages contained neat handwriting in blue ink ceremony, timings, contact numbers, protocol reminders. Tonight's memorial service would honor 3 Coldstream Guards who'd fallen in Afghanistan, and every detail had to be perfect. Their families would be watching. Their sacrifice demanded nothing less than absolute precision. Near the reception desk, a supervisor with a sharp haircut and clipboard leaned over to whisper to a colleague. Margaret Hayes, according to her name badge, had been working Terminal 5 for 8 years and prided herself on knowing every protocol, every exception, every way to bend the rules when important people needed favors. Near the reception desk, a supervisor with a sharp haircut and clipboard leaned over to whisper to a colleague. Margaret Hayes, according to her name badge, had been working Terminal 5 for 8 years and prided herself on knowing every protocol, every exception, every way to bend the rules when important people needed favors. Margaret's lips pursed slightly. Could be a mistake in the system. Americans pay good money for those diplomatic arrangements. We'll sort it if needed. C had no idea that across the terminal, in a small office marked VIP services, someone was already making changes to the passenger manifest. Nothing dramatic, just a few clicks, a diplomatic priority override, a box checked marked embassy personnel. Small adjustments that would soon have very large consequences. Menzies remained focused on his briefing notes, unaware that his seat assignment was about to become someone else's bargaining chip. Set. The arrival of Colonel Scott Granger was impossible to missand. That was exactly how he liked it. The 6-year-old U.S. Army attaché entered Terminal 5 like he was leading a parade, speaking loudly enough for half the security area to hear his running commentary about British efficiency and the superior way Americans handled air travel. "You Brits and your queues," he announced, to no one in particular, his voice carrying across the departure lounge with the confidence of a man who'd never been told to lower it. "Seriously, if I had $1 for every time I stood in line at this place, I could buy that country pub in Surrey I keep threatening to retire to." His military fatigue jacket hung casually over a navy T-shirt that stretched tight across a middle-aged spread he blamed on too many embassy dinners. The duffel bag slung over his shoulder bore nameplate stitching that might as well have been in neon lights. C.S. Granger, U.S. Army. A small American flag patch adorned his collar, slightly faded from what he claimed was field use, but looked suspiciously like intentional distressing. Several business travelers looked up from their phones, frowning at the volume and the casual assumption that everyone wanted to hear his observations about international travel, British queuing culture, and the superiority of American military logistics. "Back home, we'd have this whole check-in process streamlined," he continued to a bemused security guard. "Digital everything, no paperwork, boom, you're through. But hey, tradition, right? Got to love the old world charm." Granger made his way to the British Airways Executive Lounge, flashing a diplomatic passport and special clearance badge that got him immediate access. The moment he stepped inside and spotted Menzies by the window, his entire demeanor shifted from loud friendliness to something sharper, more calculating. "Oh, hell," he said, not bothering to lower his voice even in the quieter lounge atmosphere. "Didn't know we had community theater performances this early in the morning. Where's the rest of the Renaissance Fair?" A young stewardess at the reception desk tried to intervene, recognizing the brewing situation. "Sir, that's actually a serving member of..." Granger waved her off with the dismissive gesture of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Relax, sweetheart." I know the typeful costume regalia for press events and flag-waving ceremonies. I've seen plenty of them at Arlington National Cemetery. Guys who think standing still for photos counts as military service. Key. He leaned against the reception desk with practiced casualness, the kind of pose he'd perfected during 26 years of working his way up through military bureaucracy. Besides, last I checked, the Revolutionary War ended a while back. Thought you Brits might have gotten the memo about updating your uniforms. The stewardess looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Granger's loud confidence and Mensis's quiet dignity. "Sir, if you could just—" "I was told my seat was being held," Granger interrupted, turning his attention back to business. "1A, right? Colonel Scott Granger, U.S. Embassy Detail, traveling on official diplomatic business. Please tell me there's not some bureaucratic mix-up that's going to make me late for a very important meeting in Scotland." The woman behind the desk frowned at her screen, scrolling through the passenger manifest. "Sir, Seat 1A is currently assigned to a royal guard traveling under ceremonial clearance from St. James's Palace." Granger whistled Lotha, sound carrying just enough disbelief to make his point. "The guy with the fuzzy hat and the toy soldier outfit. Seriously." He leaned closer, dropping his voice to what he probably thought was a confidential whisper but was still loud enough for 3 nearby passengers to hear clearly. "Look, this isn't about comfort or legroom. It's about international relations and proper diplomatic protocol. I'm flying in official U.S. military uniform under embassy clearance to represent American interests at a joint NATO briefing. If some guy in a Halloween costume is sitting up front while the actual military officer is stuck in coach, that sends exactly the wrong message back to Washington." The agent looked genuinely distressed. "But sir, the ceremonial protocol can be flexible when real diplomacy is involved." Granger finished with a smile that managed to be both charming and threatening. "Trust me, honey. You really don't want the American embassy calling Downing Street because tea-time tradition got in the way of actual international relations. These costume guards are great for the tourists. But when grown-up business needs to happen, priorities need to be adjusted accordingly." Margaret Hayes, the supervisor who'd been watching the entire exchange from across the lounge, approached with her clipboard and the expression of someone about to solve a problem with administrative efficiency. After a whispered conversation with her staff and several purposeful screen taps, she made the override that would change everything. "We'll handle this discreetly," she told Granger as a new boarding pass printed slowly from the counter's machine. "No need to make it dramatic or embarrassing for anyone involved. Just a simple seat reassignment." Granger grinned with visible satisfaction, pocketing the new boarding pass. "Happens all the time in international travel. Sometimes you have to make practical decisions about who really needs to be where." 20 feet away, Menzies continued reading his briefing folder, completely unaware that his seat had just been given away not for safety reasons, not due to aircraft maintenance or overbooking, but because someone had decided that volume and self-importance mattered more than centuries of military protocol and royal appointment. When boarding was finally announced over the terminal speaker system, a ground staffer approached Menzies with the kind of apologetic expression usually reserved for delivering very bad news to people who didn't deserve it. "Color Sergeant, I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience," she began, her voice carrying genuine regret. "There's been a security reshuffle due to international diplomatic protocols that we weren't made aware of until just now. You've been reassigned to seat 7D. It's still business class accommodations, of course." Menzies looked down at the new boarding pass, then back at her face. For just a moment, something flickered behind his calm blue eyes, not anger or indignation, but the quiet understanding of a man who'd encountered this kind of casual disrespect before. The assumption that his uniform was just fancy dress, that his service was merely ceremonial pageantry for tourists. He didn't argue. didn't demand explanations or threaten to call his superiors, didn't ask who had made the change or insist on knowing why his original reservation had been overruled. "Understood," he said simply, accepting the new boarding pass with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the morning. Behind him, Granger was already positioning himself at the front of the boarding line, holding his phone high to snap a selfie with the gate number visible in the background. VIP treatment. He chuckled loudly to another passenger waiting nearby. This is just how things work when you represent serious military power instead of tourist attractions. Neither man knew that in exactly 5 minutes, one of them would discover what happened when real military protocol decided it had been insulted long enough. The boarding process began with the usual organized chaos of international travel. Families struggled with oversized carry-ons. Business travelers clutched laptops and checked their watches, and flight attendants smiled professionally while checking boarding passes and directing passengers to their seats. When Menzies stepped aboard the aircraft, the contrast was immediate and impossible for anyone to ignore. Sprawled comfortably in Seat 1, the seat that had been reserved under royal ceremonial clearance, sat Colonel Granger. His legs were stretched wide in the spacious first-class accommodation, a glass of sparkling water already in hand, his fatigue jacket hanging from the overhead bin like a territorial flag claiming conquered ground. "Hey there, soldier boy," he called out with a smirk that several passengers would later describe as genuinely unpleasant. "Hope you enjoy the view from steerage back there. Maybe next time, try wearing a real uniform instead of something from the local theater company's costume closet." Duh. Words hung in the cabin air like smoke from a fired gun. Other passengers turned in their seats, expressions ranging from shock to disgust. A businessman in row 2 actually winced at the casual cruelty of it. Menzies didn't respond, didn't slow his pace or acknowledge the insult. He simply continued to his assigned seat with the same measured composure that had allowed him to stand motionless for hours while tourists prodded him. Comedians mocked him, and photographers treated him like a prop for their vacation photos. But the cabin had noticed everything, and the reaction was swift and unmistakable. Boy in row 3 tugged insistently at his mother's sleeve. "Mum, wasn't that man supposed to be sitting at the front? I thought you said he was important." She looked genuinely puzzled, her voice carrying far enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I thought so too, sweetheart. I saw them print the passenger manifest earlier. His name was definitely listed for first class." An older woman across the aisle leaned forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "He absolutely had that seat originally. I watched them check him in myself. What kind of airline moves a royal guard for some loudmouthed American?" Near row 5, a young man pulled off his expensive noise-canceling headphones, his attention caught by the unusual disturbance. "Wait, that's one of the Queen's guards, isn't it? They don't get bumped from first class. There's got to be some kind of protocol." The whispers spread through the cabin like ripples across still water, growing stronger with each row they reached. Business travelers who'd been absorbed in their phones looked up with interest. Families traveling for vacation found themselves witnesses to something that felt historically significant. Even passengers who didn't fully understand British military traditions recognized disrespect when they saw it delivered so blatantly. Menzies settled into seat 7D, carefully positioning his bearskin across his lap and adjusting his ceremonial saber to avoid bothering his seatmates. His expression revealed absolutely nothing. No anger, no embarrassment, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. But his stillness spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. A flight attendant passing by with pre-departure drinks stopped and frowned, leaning toward the cabin manager who was checking passenger counts near the galley. "Excuse me, wasn't that seat supposed to be for the Royal Guard? I thought ceremonial personnel had priority booking." The manager, A middle-aged woman who'd seen enough airline politics to last several lifetimes grimaced uncomfortably. "Don't get involved in passenger relations, Michelle." The American officer outranks him diplomatically. "Someone upstairs made the call." "But he's traveling on royal orders." The attendant protested quietly. "Doesn't that supersede regular diplomatic clearance? Just serve the drinks and avoid any controversy," the manager replied. But even she looked troubled by the situation. The passengers weren't prepared to avoid controversy. An elderly gentleman in row 6 stood slightly, peering over the seatbacks with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Excuse me," he said to a passing steward, his voice carrying the crisp authority of old-school British propriety. "I'd like to understand why the Royal Guardsman was moved from his assigned seat. He checked in before that American officer, and I believe ceremonial personnel have established priority." The steward hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I believe it was, security-related, sir. Sometimes diplomatic requirements necessitate last-minute changes. Security." The gentleman's voice carried just enough volume to be heard several rows back. "I've flown with ceremonial guards, equerries, and royal escorts before. They don't get bumped from first class for visiting brass, no matter how loud that brass happens to be." A woman in row 8 held up her phone, showing her seatmate a BBC News article she'd quickly located. "Look at this. Royal Guards travel under diplomatic clearance for official duties. It says right here that ceremonial personnel have protocol priority for any travel related to royal functions." Spread. The information spread through quiet conversations and shared screens. Passengers passing phones back and forth to read the regulations that clearly supported Menzies' original seat assignment. The mood in the cabin was shifting from confusion to something much more pointed. Up in row 1A, Colonel Granger was beginning to sense that his moment of triumph wasn't being received quite as positively as he'd expected. The friendly chuckles that had greeted his earlier jokes about British queuing had stopped entirely. Flight attendants seemed to be avoiding his section of the cabin. Even the businessman in 1C was pointedly looking out the window rather than engaging in conversation. He glanced back toward row 7, where Menzies sat in perfect stillness and, for the first time since boarding, Colonel Granger's confident smile began to falter just slightly around the edges. While the cabin hummed with quiet tension and whispered conversations about protocol and respect, Menzies reached into an inner pocket of his scarlet tunic and withdrew a small, discreet communication device that most passengers would have mistaken for an outdated mobile phone. Military personnel on ceremonial duties carried them for exactly these situations, when protocol was violated and higher authorities needed to be informed immediately. The device was connected to encrypted channels that bypassed normal telecommunications entirely, linking directly to military command structures that most civilians never knew existed. Bet with practiced efficiency, Menzies typed 4 simple words that would set in motion a series of events no one on the aircraft could have anticipated. "Seat assignment violated. Proceed." The message traveled through secure networks, arriving within seconds at Horse Guards headquarters in Whitehall, where a duty officer with 30 years of military experience read it once, understood immediately the implications, and placed an urgent call to the ceremonial liaison office at St. James's Palace. The conversation was brief, professional, and absolutely decisive. "Protocol violation confirmed," the palace contact said without preamble. "Escalate immediately with full ceremonial authority. This cannot stand." Within 6 minutes, that same contact was speaking directly to Neil Castor, British Airways Director of Security and a former logistics officer with the Household Division who understood exactly what he was hearing when royal protocol was mentioned in connection with airline seating disputes. Castor, who had spent enough years in military logistics to recognize when something had gone seriously wrong. Didn't need further explanation or detailed instructions. Understood completely. I'm grounding the aircraft immediately and sending new senior crew. This will be corrected within the next 10 minutes. In the cockpit, the pilot's secure communication line buzzed with a distinctive tone reserved for operational emergencies. He listened to the brief, clear instructions, nodded professionally, then turned to his co-pilot with an expression that suggested their routine flight to Edinburgh had just become anything but routine. "We are holding pushback indefinitely," he announced. "Director's orders. Complete crew replacement coming aboard, and we are not moving until this gets sorted properly." He reached for the internal phone and called the lead steward with the kind of calm urgency that made veteran flight crews pay immediate attention. "You're about to receive new operational assignments through your terminal. Check your system in exactly 60 seconds. Implement immediately and don't ask questions until we're airborne." The cabin crew's primary communication tablet pinged softly with an incoming priority message. "New crew manifest. New operational instructions," and 3 words in red text that made everything crystal clear to anyone who understood airline hierarchy. "Director, override. Immediate, The forward passenger doors reopened with a hydraulic hiss that made every passenger look up from their phones and magazines. 2 uniformed British Airways staff members boarded with a kind of purposeful stride that indicated serious authority in operations. Manager wearing the 4 gold stripes that meant real power, and the new senior steward sporting the maroon epaulets that identified him as management-level crew. Gate. They walked directly to the forward galley without acknowledging passengers, speaking in the kind of low, urgent tones that suggested consequences were about to be delivered to someone who richly deserved them. The operations manager immediately located Margaret Hayes, the flight supervisor who had personally authorized Granger's seat upgrade and who was now standing near the galley, checking passenger counts with the casual confidence of someone who believed she'd solved a minor diplomatic problem. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, but with unmistakable finality, "you're relieved of duty immediately. Collect your personal belongings and disembark the aircraft now." Her face went white as the implications hit her. "What? Why? What's happened?" "Terminal Command will provide a full debrief when you report upstairs," he replied without elaboration. "This is not a discussion. Move immediately." There was no argument because there was no room for argument. She gathered her clipboard and identification badge with shaking hands and left the aircraft, her eyes darting frantically between row 1 and row 7. As she tried to understand what force she had inadvertently challenged and why it was responding with such swift, decisive authority. The new senior steward took her place and, without pause or ceremony, walked directly to row 7, where Menzies continued to sit in perfect stillness, apparently unaware that his single encrypted message had just triggered a response from the highest levels of British institutional power. "Color Sergeant," the steward said quietly, with the respectful tone reserved for addressing someone whose authority derived from sources far older and more powerful than airline management. "With our sincere apologies and those of the Crown Travel Office, we're returning you to your properly assigned seat immediately." Menzies looked up, and for the first time since boarding, something almost like satisfaction flickered behind his calm blue eyes, not triumph or vindication, but simple recognition that order was being restored to a universe that had briefly tilted off its proper axis. He rose with fluid grace, gathered his belongings, and walked toward the front of the aircraft while every single passenger watched in fascination. The cabin had gone completely silent except for the soft sound of his polished boots on carpet and the whispered prayers of several passengers who were suddenly very glad they hadn't been involved in disrespecting a royal guard. As he reached row 1, Colonel Granger looked up with one final attempt at bravado. "Well, I'll be damned," he said with a forced chuckle that fooled absolutely no one. Guess they finally figured out the costume party was more important than actual military business. The new steward's voice remained perfectly level, but carried undertones that made strong men reconsider their life choices. "Colonel Granger, your new seat assignment is 17F. Please gather your belongings and relocate immediately." Granger's face flushed red as the reality of the situation finally penetrated his confident assumption of American diplomatic superiority. "Excuse me, I have official embassy clearance and diplomatic immunity. You can't just cure it. Diplomatic clearance does not override Crown ceremonial protocol on British aircraft during royal assignments." The steward replied without blinking or raising his voice. "You are being moved immediately, and this is not a negotiation." The silence in the cabin was so complete that passengers 3 rows back could hear Granger's sharp intake of breath as he realized that his loud confidence had just collided with an authority structure he'd badly underestimated. He looked around the cabin, searching for support or sympathy, but found only the carefully neutral expressions of people watching a man discover that volume and bluster had their limits when they met traditions measured in centuries rather than decades. With no choice and no allies, he stood abruptly, grabbed his belongings with movements sharp enough to suggest barely controlled anger, and stalked toward the back of the aircraft without making eye contact with anyone. Menzies took his rightful place in seat 1A, positioned his bearskin ceremonially across his lap, and gazed out the window at the tarmac with the same quiet dignity he'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. No applause broke the silence. No passenger cheered or celebrated. But something had been corrected. Something important had been restored, and everyone aboard understood. They had witnessed the quiet but absolute authority of institutions that predated airlines, diplomacy, and loud Americans by several centuries. The flight to Edinburgh proceeded in relative peace, with Menzies occupying his properly assigned seat, and accepting nothing more than tea served with the kind of quiet respect that his uniform had always deserved. Back in 17F, Granger stared out the window at the Scottish countryside while learning what it felt like to be comprehensively outranked by someone who never raised his voice or made a single threat. When they landed at Edinburgh, the lesson in institutional authority continued. Waiting at the gate were British Airways officials and a man in an expensive dark suit whose lack of identification somehow made him more rather than less impressive. Duncan Greaves, from the protocol liaison officer presenting power structures that Americans rarely encountered and never fully understood. As Menzies exited first, Greaves offered him a respectful nod. "Your ceremonial escort is waiting, Color Sergeant. The memorial service preparations are on schedule." Behind them, Margaret Hayes stood against the terminal wall, looking pale and uncertain about to learn that challenging royal protocol carried consequences that extended far beyond temporary embarrassment. "This concludes your passenger services assignment," Greaves informed her with calm finality. "Please report to terminal management for reassignment and additional training regarding ceremonial protocols." Meanwhile, Colonel Granger emerged from the jet bridge alone, carrying his own bags, while Menzies was escorted to a discreet black vehicle bearing royal ceremonial office plates. But not everyone forgot what they'd witnessed. The gate agent, who had initially dismissed ceremonial protocol as less important than diplomatic convenience, stood quietly, replaying every moment of the past 2 hours and understanding, for the first time, that some traditions commanded respect precisely because they had earned it over centuries rather than demanding it through volume. She turned to a colleague and said, almost to herself, "We moved the wrong man, didn't we?" And somewhere in a Whitehall office, a file was closed with a single notation that would have meant nothing to most people but everything to those who understood how power really worked. Protocol maintained. Dignity preserved. Lesson delivered. Do you think the airline should have given Colonel Granger the VIP seat just because he was American? If you had been at that boarding gate, would you have spoken up for the Royal Guard? And here's the big question. Should foreign officers ever override British military tradition on UK soil? If this story stirred something in you, hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories just like this. Ring the bell so you never miss our daily uploads. Know someone who thinks the Royal Guard is just for show. Share this video with them. Let them see what happens when quiet dignity meets loud entitlement. Our other Royal Guard stories are appearing on your screen right now. Watch one next and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, with another unforgettable story that proves sometimes the quietest voices carry the most authority.